All right, welcome everyone. This is going to be the penultimate lecture for the class. This is just a bunch of predictions I have about the region and sort of some deeper thoughts about the region. And then the final lecture will be the Iran war. I'm still waiting to hear what is going on. So we're just sort of in geopolitical limbo at this point. All right, so we've talked a lot about women in the Middle East and women empowerment. And, I think if I had to answer the question from paper three, I would probably focus on economics, right? Formalizing and sectoralizing and diversifying an economy through education, and then through empowering women to get into the workforce, build experience, etc. From what we know about, some of what we know about women's liberation movements and women's opening up toward more voting rights and more protections and these sorts of things. Um, when you involve a lot of women in the economy, there's not really much going back. And so, like, if you look at just the US, for example, World War One, we really needed women in the workforce so that we could mass produce a bunch of ships and planes and tanks, right? While the men were fighting in the European theater, right? And the US didn't have it near as much as Europe did during World War One, at least. And then you see the suffragette movement, and you see the I think it's the 19th Amendment, or man, I should know that. But allowing women to vote, um, and then you also see a mass movement post World War II, where women and people of color even were allowed into the economy, right? Because we were desperate for workers so we could mass produce these weapons of war. But again, there's not really any going back. When you try to sort of put the lid back on that, as our government and many governments have tried to do, it doesn't usually work, right? And the steam starts to flow out, and you sort of get a forcing of women and minorities, et cetera, into the broader culture, because they don't want to go back to what it was before. And a lot of employers who were unwilling to sort of hire maybe the people of color or women have sort of had to eat their crow, right? Like, these were productive people. Like, this worked out. Like, we won the war. We mass produced a bunch of stuff. And so it's a lot harder to marginalize those people too, once they come through for you in the clutch, right? Okay, we'll move on to another topic. A couple of times I've touched on, I think there's going to be turmoil in the Middle East coming in the fall, August, September, October, as all of these fertilizer inputs and diesel inputs, which both sort of outpaced even rising gasoline prices, are vital inputs for farming, right? You need diesel for all the equipment that you're using, the tractors, etc. And you need those fertilizers, right? And about a third of the world's fertilizers flow through the Strait of Hormuz. This is inevitably going to mean higher food prices in the fall. Um, and that could become troublesome for this region, especially because they are highly dependent on food imports. And many times the food imports are subsidized by the state. And as they rise and rise and rise, there's going to be hard questions about whether it's sustainable for the state to pay for it. And then people start to starve, right? And this is sort of at least touching on what we saw in the Arab Spring. And so, not only that, but I also think that foreign aid is going to start maybe getting thinner in the fall as everyone's prices start to rise. A lot of economists are predicting sort of a global economic slowdown and increasing inflation moving forward through the next year or so, as until we can get this Iran stuff resolved and then get everything back online, because that takes a long time. And so, as domestic budgets for developed countries become tighter, and their own people are saying, we're hungry, we can't afford food, whatever it might be, um, then maybe they start also cutting back on foreign development aid, which means even less food flowing to the Middle East, right? So, this could break this grand bargain, right? And in many states, in many ways, the rentier states, the oil producing states, the Gulf states, should be okay. But states like Jordan, Lebanon, especially, Egypt, and some of those other sort of middling to struggling states, Syria, Yemen, are really, I think, going to have trouble this fall. Okay, prediction number 3. Israel continues to spread until someone just says, like, this is enough. We're already seeing like mass settlement growth in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, all of which is not legal under international and humanitarian law. You're seeing forced exits of those who live on the land. Now we might be seeing more land grab in Lebanon. We're really not sure yet. But this has been sort of the behavioral pattern of Israel over time, where like if they win land, they take it, right? And they have given some back, like the Golan Heights and others, but they might be spreading further north into Lebanon. And there are questions about, do they start pushing east into Syria and Jordan, especially if you start to see maybe civil conflict in those countries, which I'm not predicting, but you never know what happens. Um, then do they say, under the auspices of our own safety and maybe regional stability, we're just going to take some of this land too, right? So this is something to keep an eye on. It has been ramping up under Netanyahu, this settlement spread, etc. So, okay, speaking of Netanyahu, prediction number 4, he loses the next election. He has sort of been, I mean, the guy's credibility is not great. His approval ratings in most issues are not great. He's under trial for corruption, which has just been like spreading and spreading over time. It's been years now. Um, and we're also getting sort of some signaling and some really early news development. And I would say be careful about that. But even from inside of Israel's media establishment, I think it was the Haaretz that published this, is that Netanyahu is considering canceling the primaries for the Likud party, his own Likud party, and just saying, okay, I'm going to appoint uh, our slate of candidates, right? And so that's, he keeps making these sort of anti-democratic moves and taking a step back each time. And so that's one of the reasons that the left really despises this guy for the most part in Israel, right? Because Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and the others, at least in the coalition that's in charge right now, tend to be the very right and far right, even like very far right. Um, and so the left is kind of pissed because he's talking about canceling primaries. He has been pushing for many years to change the Supreme Court rules and their jurisprudence over the executive branch. And he even sort of split the attorney general job to make it like harder to look at the executive branch, these sorts of things. And so there's a lot of criticism there. And then there's from kind of both sides of criticism about October 7th and like, why was it such a surprise? How did we not have intelligence about this? All of these sorts of questions too. And then he is also sort of catching shit from the right, even again for October 7th, but he's also trying to push mandatory service for the ultra Orthodox population in his country. And so Israel has mandatory service, and even a lot of like foreign Jews will go back to Israel. My mom grew up in the Northeast, and she had friends that would go back, even though they were like born in New York and New Jersey or whatever. they would go do their 2 years of service when they became of age. But the ultra orthodox has always had an out on that, right? They could go to study the Torah in one of their synagogues. I'm not sure of the terminology, right? But the ultra orthodox sort of segment of the population always had an exception to the rule, and Netanyahu is trying to sort of cancel that, and so he's also getting some heat from the right. Okay, so yeah, I think if Netanyahu comes up for election, he's done so. What was that? That was my fourth prediction. All right, here's my fifth prediction. The next United States administration, maybe regardless of which party wins the presidential election or what the sort of executive legislative breakdown looks like, I think that we take a step back from Israel, which will be fascinating, right? Because it's been almost 80 years since 1948 when Israel became independent, and the U.S. has been a staunch backer of Israel. Um, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think for the geopolitical reason, we'll still be involved in many sense, right? Like there's a strong relationship between the two states. But in the United States, sentiment for Israel is waning. And in recent primary elections, we have seen donors who take money from AIPAC, which is an Israeli lobby, catch a lot of heat, right? And some donors are actually turning down AIPAC donation money. And so it seems like both sides are a little bit frustrated with the relationship with Israel. There was a lot of frustration from the left during the Biden administration for the really strong ties and the weapons involvement and these sorts of things. And now under Trump too, there's frustration from the right, even about, like you said, we weren't going to get into more wars. And now you and Netanyahu look buddy buddy and like all this stuff. So it's kind of fascinating to see this play out over the last, I don't know, maybe a decade or so. Um, but I'm kind of predicting that maybe the U.S. starts to ask questions about settlements and about weapons purchases and about a lot of these sorts of things, right? Or maybe they'll at least just be quieter about it. All right, my sixth prediction. China will have a U-shaped curve relationship with the Middle East. We talked about in the final unit Chinese soft power in the region and how they're trying to sort of develop new ties, not only economic and military, but also cultural and linguistic and all of these sorts of things. Um, but I think, in a sense, China doesn't really want a very long term relationship with the Middle East. They want a short to middle term relationship with the Middle East. For a few reasons, right? Here's some context for that. One, they have growing needs for petroleum inputs. We've talked about before, petroleum is important for energy, for gasoline, for diesel, for plastics inputs, for manufacturing inputs, for greases and lubricants, and I mean, just name something, right? Probably your Laffy Taffy's got petroleum in it. Uh, and so there is a growing need in China, right, to develop as much energy infrastructure as they can. They're trying to tap into their own found resources recently. They're still running a bunch of coal plants and et cetera, right? But they are trying to shift green. And they are moving one of the fastest nations on earth, especially for such an enormous population, right? Toward green. They would love to cut down on the pollution in their major cities from things like coal plants and gas and gasoline and diesel burning, all these things. And so eventually, I think they're going to move away from. And I actually think the rest of the world is shifting away from the Middle East. The U.S. has been like all gung ho about oil and oil exports and extraction and natural gas, all that. But most states, especially after this whole Strait of Hormuz and the Iran war thing, just dumped a shitload of money into green R&D, infrastructure, technology, etc. And it's getting cheaper and cheaper as time goes on. Um, and China's going to win that game too. It looks like because they developed, the cheapest EVs on Earth and the entire solar panel industry and all of this. And so I think that eventually China shifts away. All right, the final, not prediction, but a question I would love to contemplate, and I would love for you to contemplate. I don't have an answer to this yet, and it hit my brain, and I went, oh man, I need to think about that. Here's my question. Is the United States shift toward natural gas, oil, etc. exports over the last 15 to 20 years? We used to be an importer. We have massively expanded all of that, right, without sort of the wealth sharing of Norway. Is that devolving women's rights in the United States? Um, the scrapping of Roe, and many other sort of Supreme Court decisions in recent times, and the devolvement of power back to the states under federalism. And I don't have an answer, but I really want to think deeply about it. And so, again, is the U.S.'s shift toward export status in the rentier economy, right? We're not a rentier state, but um, is that devolving women's rights in the United States? All right. That's the penultimate lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm going to get one up on Iran either tomorrow or, I mean, yeah. I got to do it eventually. So, okay. Have a great day.